G'day viewers, Bucks Gas Garage. Today we've just got a short video on changing out the fuel pump on the 4.2 litre WB Holden Ute. Same goes right from probably HT Holden right up to probably VK Commodore, VL Commodore with the 308 V8 in it. Should pretty much be the same pump for all of them. Anyway, let's get into it. So here we have the engine. You can see the fuel filter that's sitting there at the moment is empty. I noticed this morning that there was a strong smell of fuel and that there's constant drain back from the fuel filter, which tends to indicate the pump. This is the pump here. It's a mechanically driven one, runs off the camshaft, I'm pretty sure, but obviously it's got that faulty. It's actually starting to leak out the front valve, and now not supplying enough fuel to the engine, which I will show you now. As you can see there's lots of bubbles in the fuel filter, which should be full, which means obviously that the pump is sucking in air and obviously not supplying enough fuel to the system. So we'll swap this pump over now. Okay, so here are pretty much the tools required to do the job. Now, as you'll see, I've just got a ramp under the driver's side of the car at the moment. Just makes it a bit easier to access the bottom of the fuel pump. Obviously what's required, I've got two spanners here. One's a 1/2 inch, one's a 13. Probably go for the 1/2 inch, but if you haven't got it, the 13mm spanner should be okay, but just be careful with it. Also, I've got a bit of a catch tray there, just an ice cream container to catch any residual fuel coming out of the pump and lines. Obviously the fuel pump, which we have here, this is the new fuel pump here, which we can see. So the long arm there, obviously the pump sits upside down like this with the arm that runs on the back side of the camshaft there. This arm is operated up and down by the camshaft. You've got your two fittings there, basically your fuel inline here, this one here, and then your pressure out is this nut one here. Now also for the nut that screws into this is also 1/2 inch spanner, but you will need a screwdriver, as I've got up here. A couple of screwdrivers for any hose clamps holding the fuel lines on. Also a set of needle nose pliers. Also if you have the different size clamps. Now I have got a crawler or mechanic's trolley here to slide in and under the car, which just makes it a little bit easier. But that's about it required to change the fuel pump. As you can see here, this is the bottom of the fuel pump, which we obviously have to remove the fuel line there, and you can see the other nut on the other side there that has to be removed to get the fuel line off. So a little bit difficult to hold the camera, so I'll just whip these clips off and we'll get the fuel lines off. As you can see here, I've removed the fuel line. At this stage you shouldn't have to hold the fuel line up, which is just sitting right there. As you can see, it's the level of the tank must be lower than that. I've got about 1/4 of a tank of fuel. You can see just here that the rubber hose is off, and at the moment I've just cracked the nut and draining the residual fuel out of the fuel line and fuel filter above. So this 90-degree fitting here also will have to be removed from the pump. It doesn't come in the kit with the original, so we'll go further on with it. Next part moving on is to remove the bottom bolt from the fuel pump, which is you'll see it right here. Sorry about the filming, but it's in the light, a little bit hard to see, but this is the bottom nut here for the fuel pump to be removed. Just moving on to the top nut now, which you can see is located here. Again, 1/2 inch. So that up fairly tight. You can see I've removed the top nut there. All the fuel lines are off, and hopefully it should be just a case of pulling it out. It still is sitting attached on the stud in the block below, so getting a bit of movement there. We may have to undo that nut further than it currently is to remove it. The bottom nut and washer are removed because there's actually a stud in the block. Let's have a go at removing it now. Look at that, easy as. So that's the fuel pump there, out, and as you can see the bottom stud sitting there that has a nut and a washer on it. Obviously you've got the gasket material there and the arm where it rides up in. Okay, so now what we need to do is remove the right angle fitting that you can just see there. Put that on the new pump, scrape the gasket material off, and get the new gaskets ready to put the new pump in. So here we have the old pump here, which you can see is a bit oily and so on. You can see this is where it runs on the camshaft here. It pushes up and down on this arm to obviously do the fuel pumping. So the cam just pushes up and down. It's only a minute amount that it runs in and out. But we've just got to take this fitting out here and then refit here, and we should be right to put the new one back in. Okay, so here we have our pump back together with the 90-degree fitting in it. Now I did want to take the fuel line off and fit the fuel line before refitting because it was slightly deformed, this fitting. I just wanted to make sure that there was no cross thread when the fuel line was screwed back in. So now we'll clean up the gasket surfaces and continue on. You can see here the old gasket is still sitting on the surface there at the moment. So normally I use a razor blade or similar to remove. I'll just have to work out which way I'm going to attack it, but normally a razor blade is the best way to go to clean up the surfaces. Just going to do a quick trial fit to make sure that the cam lines up with the arm. In this case, if it doesn't, we'll have to rock the car backwards and forwards to make sure it does. But looking at that, things are looking pretty good for a lineup from what we can see there. Okay, so the kit actually came with two gaskets, but I'm just going to install one. The other thing I normally use when fitting up parts to engines and so on is Loctite MR5923. It's an aviation gasket sealant. It's a non-hardening sealant, but it certainly helps the gaskets seal up if you're a little suspect. As you can see up here, we're all cleaned up there. It does look like there's residue, but I can assure you it's all flat and nice and clean. So I've wire brushed it and razor bladed the fitting. And we're ready to put the gaskets in. So here you can see we have the gasket in place. It can actually go either way. It helps that the stud is in the bottom to actually line the gasket up. So we'll just slip the fuel pump in now and just make sure we get a good seal with it. So as you can see, we've got our top bolt in. A bit tedious doing it up with a spanner, but you've got to hold pressure against the pump. So that's what I had on hand at time, so we'll continue tightening. As you can see, we're underneath now. The top top nut has been put on. Now it's just a case of tightening up the nut on the thread. Obviously extremely difficult to do holding the camera, so anyway, you get the idea. Okay, that's the new pump on. Now all that has to be done is basically re-hook up the fuel lines. Obviously, as I said, I connected the previous 90-degree joint into there because I was a bit skeptical about the thread in that, just to make sure that it was done up before the pump was mounted. Okay, you'll see here fuel lines reconnected again. Basically no leaks, right angle joint is in, no oil leaks by the looks of it coming from the sump there, which obviously oils the camshaft and so on. The gasket is sealed up nicely, fuel lines are all pliable, and as you'll see the fuel filter now is full and no air bubbles coming through the filter as we saw previously, which was obviously leaning out the vehicle. These pumps will give you a fair bit of warning before they're ready to go. The diaphragm will slowly go, it normally just doesn't go. This has been hard to start after not being used for a week because all the fuel drains back to the tank from the pump. One good thing about these new pumps, as you'll see here, is that this pump actually has a hole in the fuel pump, so if the diaphragm is failing, it will spurt the fuel out here instead of previous models which I've had on an HZ, which ended up, the diaphragm failed and the fuel ended up going straight through here, ending up in the sump, and had an explosion in the sump because the sump was full of fuel, and ended up, it'll either blow the dipstick out, or even worse, what happened to me, it blew the tappet covers clean off the engine. So one good thing about the newer style of pump for the 4.2 and 5 litres. Obviously same pump for the 5 litre, no difference, so if you're wanting to install one on a 5 litre, same thing. So that's about it. Thanks for watching that episode of Buck's Gas Garage, and as mentioned, this will pretty much work for any 4.2 or 5 litre Holden V8 engine right up until about the BL, where previous or after that they have fuel injection. Anyway, as I say, like and subscribe. Thanks.